Hi, everyone. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that ACMI and RMIT University respectfully acknowledge Indigenous ancestors and elders, past and present, and that we acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. I know we're conducting the session online, scattered across Victoria and maybe even other states and countries. I'm personally speaking to you from Melbourne's inner north and on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nations. And I think it's important to recognize that we conduct this business on their unceded territory. Indigenous sovereignty has never been extinguished. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm Douglas Wilson. I'm a lecturer at RMIT University's Bachelor of Design Games program, and I'm also a co-owner of the Danish game studio, Die Gute Fabrik. Just to recap, if you're joining us here at the Games Talks 2020 series for the first time, RMIT Games has been co-hosting this series with our friends at ACMI. This is sadly our final session of this year's series, but you can find all of the episodes recorded and archived on ACMI's YouTube channel, which is great. So if you want to listen to some really excellent Australian developers, definitely go check out the other 7 episodes. Big thanks to the ACMI staff for running this infrastructure, getting this all up online and running it and so forth. Now, we'll be taking some questions from the live YouTube chat towards the end of the session. So feel free to write your questions in the live YouTube chat, and the ACMI staff will be collecting them and kind of feeding them to us at the end of the session. Now, today, we've saved a great guest for our finale. Hi, Grace.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am going to read your bio out. I apologize, but just so everyone knows who Grace is the creative director of Melbourne-based studio Worm Club, creators of the Frog Detective series. The studio was the first to be signed to Polish label SUPERHOT Presents in 2019. She also develops a number of small-scale experimental games, which have been featured in galleries and exhibitions internationally. Grace regularly advises for Wings, which is an investment fund for games and developers. That's Grace, that's you.
That's really good because I forgot I have to do my Wings work tomorrow. So it's really good to have a reminder.
Let's kick this off. Obviously, I want to talk to you about the Frog Detective games, which are probably the games you're best known for. But first, I want to talk to you about your earlier work just a little bit. Before Frog Detective, you made a series of small 3D games full of charming characters and various jokes and so forth. I want to talk about one of those games, Alien Casino, which seemed to really capture people's imaginations. And in fact, this small little 3D game was actually exhibited a bunch of cool places around the world. Can you, for people who don't know, tell the audience what Alien Casino is? And we have some screenshots to show about it. And it's been a few years since you made that game. How do you feel about it now, kind of looking back at it?
It's been like 4 years, hasn't it? Oh my God. Yeah, so Alien Casino was like a sort of a follow-up to a game I made called The Fish Market, which was a sort of 3D world that you explore with just little jokes and stuff. You don't really do anything except for walk around. And I enjoyed making that project so much. So I decided to make a second one, like kind of not like a sequel, but just like a successor to it, called Alien Casino. And I made it directly after I'd made the first one. And the concept is that you're going to a casino that has been recreated by memory by aliens. And you're just kind of, it's sort of like a gallery. You're sort of looking around, or like a museum. You're looking at descriptions of what a casino is and like how it operates from the perspective of aliens who've only seen it once. But it was also from the perspective of me, because I kind of forgot what was in there. So it was all from memory, my memory, and also alien memory.
And so, as you mentioned, it's maybe been about 4 years since that piece. Have you played it recently? What do you think about that piece now, now that you've had the distance of time to look back on your work?
It's epic. I like it. I think it's a good game still. It's probably one of my favorite games. I haven't played it for maybe a year, because I sometimes play it for festivals and exhibitions and stuff, or talks where I walk through it and kind of just explain my work. But I feel really strongly happy about that game. Like I don't, often with old work, I feel kind of like a bit embarrassed by it, I guess, or like not proud of it, but I'm pretty consistently proud of the games that I've put out in the last four years, which is good because like with art and other stuff, like I was always just immediately ashamed of everything I created. But with video games, for some reason, I like it.
Is there like a particular aspect or theme or like joke or gag in Alien Casino that stands out to you as something that you still really happy you did?
I think that like every alien having a name is really funny to me. So like I named every alien as I made it, and like in the project just had all their names. And I wasn't intending for anyone to see those names except for me, but I was naming them as I went. And then I kind of had an idea that I would write a guide to every alien. But there's like some aliens, like one of them was called Cube, which if you've ever gone into a Unity project, it's really not a good idea to call an asset Cube. It was a bit hard to find him, but he was called Cube.
Good. Okay, so let's get right to Frog Detective now. So in late 2018, you go on to release your first commercial game, Frog Detective. The Haunted Island is the first one. Then in late 2019, you released the sequel, Frog Detective 2, The Case of the Invisible Wizard. Now, I suspect a lot of the live chat is familiar with the two Frog Detective games, but just to show everyone what these games are, let's show the gameplay trailer for Frog Detective 2. If the ACMI folks could, yes. Yeah.
Great.
Excellent. So, and we had a few comments about this in the chat. I know you worked with a couple of collaborators on that game. Tell us about the team.
Yeah, so one of them was John Romero, the creator of Doom, and the other one was Jonathan Blow, known misogynist. Anyway, no, actually, it was a bit cheeky. I worked with my partner, Thomas Belka, and our soundtrack person, Dan Golding. Yes. Both of them are very amazing. Tom came onto the project and very early on. The first game was definitely more directed by me in terms of like creative stuff. And Dan did the soundtrack. And then the second game, Tom sort of took more of a design role with it. So stuff like the notebook and like a few more of the sort of weird mechanics, like he really put his heart into. And so it's like more of a collaboration now than it was with the first game. And Dan is amazing, obviously. He also did the soundtrack for Untitled Goose Game.
Yeah. So let's, I was going to make a swimming joke. I reckon I'll move on though. let's talk a little bit about the vibe of the music and kind of your inspirations for the game. So I know you've mentioned the classic Hercule Poirot murder mystery TV show as one of the influences on the game, and certainly Dan's soundtrack for the game. But Frog Detective isn't really like most classic detective games or stories. Can you tell us a bit about what Frog Detective actually is and how you try to subvert the genre of the kind of detective story?
Yeah, so sort of Frog Detective started as like a way for me to figure out whether I could make something commercial and like what level of commercialism, not commercialism, but like mechanics or sort of very traditional game stuff that I could put into the game without it feeling untrue to what I liked. So I had done quite a lot of experimentation in the past to try and figure out the sort of balance between what sort of mechanics I liked and what I didn't, and what I felt comfortable releasing. So I sort of came to the idea of like, okay, there are things that I like in this world. One of them is frogs. Another one is detective shows and detective books. But there are things that I don't like about detective books or detective like fiction, I suppose, which is sort of this trope of detectives being a bit mean or being a bit, I don't know, abrasive in some way. I mean, Poirot is not super like that, but I felt like I wanted to create this detective character that was just really sort of chill and neutral. And I didn't necessarily need the story to be about the mystery, but I wanted to evoke that feeling of a mystery just in the sort of ambience of the game rather than the dialogue or the plot or anything. I wanted it to, the music and the sort of camera work, wanted it to sort of emulate a detective movie or like a detective show, but in a silly way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, kind of along those lines, one thing that strikes me about your work is that you tend to cite pretty different inspirations compared to a bunch of other developers I talk to. Just to pick one, to single one out, I've seen you talk about and also live stream the Freddy Fish series, which is like an old school, I think we have a screenshot to show too, an old school adventure game series that was kind of targeted at young adults. What exactly is it that stands out to you about the Freddy Fish series, and like what lessons are you drawing from it in Frog Detective, if any?
I'd honestly say that Freddy Fish was aimed at ages 3 to 8, according to the box
Oh,
art.
really? Okay.
Yeah. And the age that I played it. But I mean, I like it now. It's still good. The question was something about why do I like it? Is that
Yeah,
right?
like do you feel like you took direct influences from that game?
Not intentionally. I think because it was one of the few sort of games that I really liked growing up. Hello. Um, yeah, it was one of the few games that I liked growing up. So I was quite, I think, yeah, unintentionally inspired by it and unintentionally inspired by like its kind of playfulness and its tone. I hadn't actually played any sort of Freddy Fish games until after Frog Detective came out, recently, I mean. So I kind of didn't have a point of reference for what they were actually like from a more modern point of view, or more adult point of view. But they are really nice. And like, I think there's things to be learnt about those sort of games. And like, Frog Detective isn't necessarily for kids, but it's also something that I think kids can enjoy and adults can enjoy. It's not aimed at any age group, because to me that's kind of when I think children's media can be boring if it's aimed at children, if that makes sense. I don't know if that, yeah.
Yeah. Now, there's a lot I hugely admire about the Frog Detective series, but one main thing that really floors me is how tightly it's scoped. So each Frog Detective game was developed in about 1 year. And it's speaking as someone who's worked on a game for like way too many years. I am like super jealous of your turnaround times. Like it's easy to imagine you adding more features, more characters, more story, and so forth and so on. But it feels like you kind of knew exactly what you wanted to make, and that the game is exactly what it needs to be to delight its target audience, and not really any extra fluff. Does that scoping just come naturally to you, or do you find yourself and the team constantly like cutting ideas and cutting content as you go?
It's a bit of a mixture. I mean, so for me, like the games that I was making previously were tiny, like you can play them in 5 minutes. So for me, like making a bigger game, it was never going to be a 30-hour game because that's ridiculous. Like I can't even fathom making something that long. An hour felt like a very long time for a game that I've never made something like that before. So it's that was sort of where the basis came from. It's like, I know that I have a year to complete this game. I want to make it, like bite-sized, but not so short that people will think it's a ripoff. And like, I think, yeah, it sort of comes from my natural instinct to enjoy games that are smaller, because I have just a terrible attention span. So I kind of wanted it to feel like you're watching an episode of a detective show or of a sitcom or something. That's kind of, and I feel like that's sort of not explored super often in games, just making a game feel like an episode of a TV show rather than like a feature-length movie. So that's kind of interesting to me. But in terms of like conscious decisions, like cutting scenes or whatever, we do that because we have grand ideas of what we want to do for every single game. But anything that we've cut isn't super significant. There's no like no one's gonna know that it wasn't there, if that makes sense. It's always sort of like just silly ideas that we sort of think about and imagine and then don't end up doing. But one of them that was like an idea that we just wanted to put in, so like we changed the scope a little bit, was to have the sticker decorating bit in the second game. I thought it would be really funny if you decorated your like professional detective book with silly stickers and like it was personalized to you, so it felt very like, yeah, it felt like yours. I thought that would be quite nice. But yeah, like we're pretty good at scope. I think it's one of the, I don't want to work on games for years because I burn out quickly and I need to sort of keep moving. And that's not saying that I'll never do that, but I think for now, like I'm quite happy with sort of creatively changing every now and then of what I'm interested in. Because if I keep working on one thing, I feel like I'm just going to start hating it, and I don't want to hate Frog Detective. I don't want to hate my work.
Yep. Now, kind of along with that, like scoping, funding, releasing the game line of questioning, starting with Frog Detective 2, you were signed by the Polish label SUPERHOT Presents. And I think that pairing might have been surprising to some people, but I feel like Frog Detective is like a weirdly good match with the game SUPERHOT somehow, like in terms of like them both being these irreverent, kind of humorous games. Do you feel the same way? And why did you go with that partnership and like SUPERHOT specifically?
It's a pretty funny one. I don't know. I just think it's like part of it was the novelty of it being super hot, which is this game that I knew about. It was a shooter game. They've never signed anyone before. They're not publishers. Why are they giving us, why are they funding Frog Detective? That doesn't make any sense. It's just funny. I thought it was funny. But also like, they were a good team and we like met them and I liked them, and they were also going to give us what we wanted, which was freedom. Like we didn't want to be signed to a publisher and have to sort of bend to their whims creatively or anything. They're very hands off, but they'll also give you support when you need it. Yeah, in terms of it being a good match, I think I agree. It's surprising, but it also sort of makes sense. And it was also like, it was nice to have that announcement along with Knuckle Sandwich by Andy Brophy. So yeah, it was really great to have that sort of like, here are two sort of weird Melbourne games being signed by this, like out of absolutely nowhere. SUPERHOT is now funding games. Like it was really cool.
And yet all three of those games I still think have some kind of like humorous or aesthetic kind of connection. Like when that announcement came out, at first you're like, whoa, and then you're like, yeah, like I feel that. Anyway, I really like that. So you've now both pitched your games to like funders and publishers and stuff, but now you also receive pitches as an advisor to the Wings Investment Fund. Now, do you have any like general or specific advice about pitching games, right? Like presumably it takes more than just emailing a cool glossy PDF to a publisher once, right?
So with Wings, we kind of have a bit of a different application process than a few places do. Some places sort of require you to sort of present the pitch. I mean, less so now with the pandemic, but we've always had a sort of digital application process to make sure that we're getting, we can reach as many people as possible and there's not that barrier to entry. I think pitching is something that's really overlooked by indie developers. Same with like business development and like marketing and PR. Like these are all kind of dirty words. Like thinking about money is dirty for some reason. And that was sort of the perspective that I got when I entered games of like, oh, people that talk about business in games, they're not real artists, blah, blah, blah. But like to be realistic about working in this industry, you need to know this stuff or you're not going to survive, or I'm very supportive of people that are able to work part-time and do games as a hobby, or games like, release their games non-commercially. That's awesome. For me though, it's important to me to be able to say this is my career and this is something that I work to do. So pitching is like, it seems intimidating. I think there's not a lot of information about what makes a good pitch. For me, I felt pretty lucky because I'd gone through the pitching process with Film Vic, which was like fairly sort of straightforward, and they sort of supported us through that process as well. And I also had, so I was at RMIT in 2018. When did I graduate? 2018.
18.
And that was my final year, and there was a class where we were basically creating mini pitches for each stage of the game. And even just having that experience of like, even if it felt really weird pitching a game that to not get any money and just like pitching it felt weird, but that structure of a pitch was actually really helpful to see and kind of building confidence of like, oh, this is how, like, this is what a pitch should look like, because that information is nowhere. I've looked for it. I've spent time, because we do get some pretty bare bones or like really misguided pitches at Wings, and I've been for a while trying to figure out how we can get those resources together so that people understand what the basics are. It doesn't have, like, no pitch has to be incredible. You don't have to have an incredible pitch to be accepted. But it does help, and it's that one, it's just one less barrier to getting your game funded. If your game is amazing and it's going to make a lot of money, I think investors will see that. But to actually, sometimes it can prevent you. If you send in a pitch that is really sloppy or unthought out, or like has sales figures, like sales estimates that are ridiculous, or even sales figure estimates that are below what the investment is, like that's a big red flag for especially investors, because they need to invest in people that that they're confident can actually release their game without publishers. Whereas publishers, I think, are a little bit more lenient because they're going to be doing a lot of that marketing work. But if you're going for an investor, you need to prove that you are professional, you know how to release a game, and you're low risk. That's the biggest thing. You just need to be low risk.
And just to clarify, because there's like a whole variety of these kinds of partnerships. We talked about this a little bit with SUPERHOT, but with Frog Detective, you're kind of in charge of a lot of your own marketing, which is maybe quite different than a very formal traditional publisher relationship where they might do all of the porting, all of the marketing, all the localization. So there's a whole, I guess, range of different partnerships. And it sounds like you are more comfortable with this more hands-off, like you're okay and you like doing some of the marketing kind of work yourself.
Yeah, I think we didn't know that though. I mean, we had released Frog Detective 1, obviously without a publisher, and we were fine. But we sort of went to GDC looking for a publisher, not really knowing what the difference was. So to like kind of break it down, there's like publishers, investors, and funds. That's like the very basics. Publishers will give you money generally, or they won't. And they will do a lot of the marketing, PR, QA, all that kind of work for you so that you can focus on the development. But they will generally take a higher split of the profits because they are using their brand, they're using their resources to make your game successful. So they want to back games that are going to be successful so that their brand looks good, all that sort of thing. Investors is pretty much what it sounds like. They're people that will give you money and then they will take a cut of the profits with very little support. And then funds, generally, like funds like Film Vic won't take the money back. So funds are just brilliant and wonderful. So if you get funded by a fund, you're golden. But they also probably won't provide any support. So it really depends on your needs. And there's sort of like in betweens. Like I would say that Superhot's in between a publisher and investor, because they do some of that publishing work for us. Like they do some promo, like they have an audience, so they can show Frog Detective to their audience, and they help with PR sometimes and little things like that. But we're not reliant on them to release our game, whereas you would be with a publisher most of the time.
Now, you localized, or I'm trying to remember now. Have you been doing localization?
Like, no.
Oh, for Frog Detective? Okay, never mind.
It is a plan. We
It's a
have
plan.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Business meetings.
Would that be so right, like with a traditional publisher, they might do a lot of that biz dev work for you,
Yes.
whereas more hands-off relationship, you might have to. So now with the marketing part, which you have been doing yourself, and we'll get into that a little bit more in this conversation. But that's everything from running the Twitter feed to mailing lists to you've even been producing merch and stuff, pre-COVID traveling. That's what do you reckon your kind of balances between all that kind of biz dev support and then actually making the game itself?
It was mostly biz dev for last year for Frog Detective 2. Like the majority of the year was doing biz dev work because we were focused on, so we'd released, we had released Frog Detective 1, and we were, it had gone fine. Like we'd done Twitter marketing, done a couple of events, like it was a reasonable amount of sales for the amount of, like we had zero marketing budget essentially. So what we needed to do with Frog Detective 2 was during the time of development and all of that promotion work, I needed to make sure that I was building up Frog Detective 1 to sort of, because it's like, there's no point. I mean, it's hard to sell a game that doesn't have an audience to begin with. And we always knew that was a risk doing sequel. But actually what happened is because people were interested in Frog Detective 2, they're like, okay, what's Frog Detective 1? And then they would check out Frog Detective 1. And that, for example, I think the first week that we released Frog Detective 2, the sales were basically matched with Frog Detective 1, like on that same day. So like people were either buying Frog Detective 2 or buying Frog Detective 1 or both. Which was kind of surprising, I guess. I hadn't really planned for that. Obviously, I'd never done a sequel before, but it was really sort of encouraging, and it meant that we know now that the more games we make, hopefully that effect will continue. And yeah, the other marketing stuff was sort of trying to build a community and build a brand around Frog Detective, because I really believe in it, and I really love it. And I feel like hopefully that shows in the game, and it's sort of an unusual game in the way that it is. I don't know, it's hard to compare it to other games. I mean, the closest game that I compare it to is A Short Hike, which came out after. But even that's different in terms of mechanics. Yeah. And I also experimented with some merch production when we went to PAX West, and then we got Fangamer. Fangamer made some plushies.
Wow.
And they've sent us a bunch, so I don't know, but they're really cute and soft, and yeah. And so that's really good, and that's sort of, it is a marketing tool, but it's also like mostly just me being excited that I have a little toy.
Yep. I want to return back to some of those questions about kind of marketing and being online in just a bit, but first, just kind of wrap up some of like your creative work on the game. I'm interested in kind of how you, before you're about to release a Frog Detective or whatever game, you kind of play tested, or how you try to finish it up. So like both in my own work and watching my students, I find that playtesting narrative games is often like a lot trickier than playtesting really kind of challenge heavy games. Like it's often easier for players, I think, to talk about in like a really specific way about mechanics and game feel and balance than it is fuzzier things like characterization, writing, comedy. Now you have this great GDC talk, which we'll link in the chat, called Building Games Around Humor. And in this talk, you compare playtesting Frog Detective to workshopping a comedy routine. And so I wanted to know, like, what kind of feedback do you look for when showing these narrative games?
Yeah, it is definitely harder to play test narrative games because you have to be looking for different things. Like when you're playtesting a sort of platform or whatever, you can sort of see, okay, I want to see where the person gets stuck. Whereas like Frog Detective is quite straightforward in terms of the actual gameplay. So we needed to look at things that maybe, yeah, it's like stuff like, does this joke hit? Do they understand it? Is the timing right? Also, like, who are the people most drawn to? So one of the ways that we did that was we had Frog Detective 2 at PAX West and Bit Summit and a couple other places. And we had this sort of system at the end where you could vote for who you thought was the most suspicious character. I mean, obviously, like, it doesn't tell you who actually did it, but it was just sort of interesting to see which characters were suspicious, and like, you know, just talking to people about who they liked and who they didn't like, or what their opinions were about the characters, and also like kind of asking them who they remembered after was kind of helpful. Like a couple of days later, like, who do you remember from the game? Like, who was your favorite character? And they'll be like, and whoever sticks out in the memory, like if they can remember a character's name 2 days later, that probably means that character is memorable.
Yep. Now in 2019, I want to link another cool talk that you gave. In 2019, you gave a keynote talk at the Play by Play conference in New Zealand, where you discussed making games that you actually enjoy making rather than making the games that you think you should be making. How do you keep that motivation and balance like with the Frog Detective series? Like, what about Frog Detective really keeps calling you back to the series? Like, you obviously came back to it to do a sequel.
I think that was 2018 because that was before Frog Detective 1 was out. But yes.
Oh, sorry, 2018. Okay.
That's fine. Yeah, I think it's honestly just a attention span thing again. I do struggle working on things that I don't enjoy. I really need to enjoy something to work on it. And that's not to say that like I've always every second of every minute enjoyed working on Frog Detective, because that's not true. I do have very low days and low 9 months of work. So it's hard to say what is actually the what brings me back, but I think it's just like starting from a base of actually really liking a character and actually really liking the concept. I'm not, you know, I didn't make Frog Detective to become rich or to like mass appeal to a market. I made Frog Detective because I thought it would be funny, and it was. And so it's like, I know that there's like unlimited possibilities to do with this sort of format, similar to like a TV show, right? You could have lots and lots of episodes of a sitcom. And you can sort of see when people enjoy writing it or when they enjoy making it. And I wanted to have that feeling with Frog Detective, to always enjoy and feel fresh after every episode. And that includes like just making things really ridiculous and like twists and all this sort of stuff. Sort of adds up to a game that is really, it feels nice to play. But the reason it feels nice to play is because we liked making it, I think.
Yeah. Now, it's tempting to kind of just ask you about those more like fun and positive aspects of like making your own games, you know, like you like for the most part, aside from those lulls, making Frog Detective. But I know you've also talked publicly on the topic that like kind of struggling with the toll of interacting with social media and like kind of always being so visible as a front person of this game. Now, I noticed Frog Detective 1 was originally titled with your name, Great Bruxner Presents The Haunted Island. And I noticed you removed your name from the title of the sequel. Can you talk a little bit about that change and how you've had to kind of like adapt to social media to make your life, your work life more sustainable?
Yeah, so with the title thing, it's still listed as that in the actual game, I think, when you open it up. My concern was, especially releasing on Steam, which I hadn't released on before, I was concerned that having my name prominently on the front of an indie game, like, to be frank, like a woman's name right at the start of a game is probably going to set some bad people's expectations and like kind of open me up to criticism that I don't necessarily deserve. So I was like, I just want to avoid it. I'm just going to call it Frog Detective and make it easier to find in the, you know, in the search anyway. In terms of removing Grace Bruxner from the second game, that was more of a decision about acknowledging the work of the collaborators more. And I definitely feel conflicted about the first game having my name. I do believe that the majority of the creative work was mine. But I also like, I kind of got stuck with that that solo game developer label, which was just explicitly not true.
Yeah.
And I felt really sort of uncomfortable not giving the people that worked on the game the credit, especially my partner. So like, yes, I am sort of the more public face of Worm Club and Frog Detective, but I'm also like not the only one. And I want to make sure that I'm not pretending that that's the truth, because that would make me uncomfortable. So it's like, yeah, it's a Worm Club game now.
Great. Yeah, no, it makes sense. I've been kind of yammering on long enough asking you these questions. Let's take some questions from the chat. We already have a few, which I'll read out some of them. You've got maybe 10 or 15 minutes left if you're live in the chat to ask your questions. So definitely feel free to keep asking those. We have one question here. How does it affect you that one of your early games became successful? Do you think your style would have changed if it had taken more attempts?
It depends which game they're talking about. I guess Alien Casino or the Fish Market, right?
Alien Casino, yeah.
I don't know if I would. Alien Casino was successful, but not in a way that it gave me a big head or anything. Like, it was sort of successful in the fact that it was the first time that I understood people were comfortable playing my games, or like it was fine to make games that like that, because I didn't understand that prior to making those games. I didn't know that that was okay. So I think it wouldn't have affected me much. I think it would have been more discouraging, or like if nobody had liked those games at all, I think I would be more inclined to make something a little bit more traditional, a little bit more commercially, I don't know, standard. Which I wasn't opposed to doing, but I just, I was experimenting. And then when I realized that these experiments were like actually resonating with people, I'm like, oh, so I can just do this. I can do this fun thing that I like. Like, that's really nice. So yeah, I don't think it would have changed a lot. Except, yeah, I might have been drawn to more wide-reaching things that maybe would be less interesting.
Maybe along that kind of topic, we have another question here. Is there an easy rule or principle to follow when trying to find the balance between making money and making the games you want?
I don't think they need to be mutually exclusive. I feel like for me and Tom as well, like our sort of understanding of the games that we make is we want to make something that we would like and play and enjoy. Because I wouldn't want to make a game that I didn't like. I don't know. It's sort of hard. I think there's this sort of misunderstanding about selling games, that you really have to pay attention to what everyone else wants. But I just don't think that's true. I don't think it is. Like, I think you can, it's good to pay attention to that stuff if your main focus is to make money, but it wasn't for us. We want to sustain ourselves. We just want to, continue to pay rent and be comfortable and eat food. Like, we're not that concerned about fame or riches or whatever. And maybe if we were, then yes, we would make something much more commercial, but we just want to exist and continue to make things that make us happy.
Another question, for people who might lack the confidence to present or sell their work, how do you think that skill can be improved?
It sort of depends. I don't think you need to be a public figure to sell games. I think a lot of really successful games are made by people that are a little bit anonymous, and that's awesome. Like, I guess a good example would be like Golf Story, that game that came out on Switch a couple of years ago, and like nobody really knows who made it. It was someone in Queensland, but nobody, like the game dev community doesn't know who they are. So I feel like networking requires a bit of confidence. You don't have to be like, hey, what's up? You just have to sort of, trust that people want to like you and talk to you and that sort of thing. But it's also not a requirement to make a game that is successful, I think. But those soft skills are really important to learn. Learning like how to talk to people, how to pitch a game can be really helpful. And that's not like a requirement to make a game, but it's also, it is helpful. Like it'll help you out, not just in games or like making money, but in like just day-to-day life and enjoying your time in the industry and making friends, that sort of thing.
And it's still got a few questions actually about, I think a bunch of people are interested in this kind of like the business side of games. We have a question here. What other skills did you have to learn on the fly post-graduation once you were in the process of selling and marketing Frog Detective? Were there other key skills you were teaching yourself then?
Ooh, yeah, I mean, a lot, I suspect. Would be like how to talk to publishers, because that's not something that is really covered in, well, wasn't covered in my time in the course. So how do I set up these meetings? Who do I contact? Who are the publishers? Stuff like, how do you start a company? What kind of taxes do I have to pay? How much tax do I have to pay on a game if I release it? To stuff like, okay, if I'm shipping out merch for a game, how do I do that? How much does it cost? What do I have to declare it? Do I have to do blah, blah, blah? Like just really tiny little things that you sort of add up and learn as it goes along. But even sort of basic stuff like understanding why someone would give me money for my game in terms of like investment. Like I don't think I really understood, even though I like vaguely understood, I just never really thought about the fact that to get investment or to get a publisher, I just have to make sure that my game isn't a risk for them, and that's why they want to make money off my game. That's why. It's not because I was always going with like Film Vic or whatever, that's not their main goal.
Right.
Their main goal isn't to make money, but to sort of support the industry. Whereas like more businessy people are more focused on the things that I don't think about. Like, well, I think about them now, but I didn't think about them at the time. Like, who's the market and boring stuff like that.
We have a kind of different question about more about the game itself. Grace, what's your favorite parts in Frog Detective 2? Do you have a favorite part?
Bit of a spoiler. It's kind of at the start of the game, but I really like the Lobster Cop entry scene when Lobster Cop enters the scene. And it's like kind of action sequence. I think that's a really funny scene. And it was also like maybe the only scene in the game that all three of us really had an equal part in creating. So I'd storyboarded it and done some initial of the like, I don't know, camera work. And then Tom took over the camera work and made it better. And then Dan like came in with this just incredible soundtrack. And I feel like it's long and silly and it's exactly what I wanted. And I think it is just perfect, especially with the build up from the first game where everyone talks about Lobster Cop all the time. It was, Lobster Cop, I think people thought maybe it was just a character that everyone mentions, but it was just like funny to bring him in as a real character.
Yeah. Well, on that topic of like taking references from the first game, expanding into the second game, we have a question here. Frog Detective 2 feels like a really smart evolution of 1. For example, adding the detective book. How did you decide where to expand on exactly on top of Frog Detective 1?
Part of it was feedback from players. So like I think me and Tom, we've said this before, but one of the most significant pieces of feedback that we got was from players that felt disappointed, and we were like confused by that. I think we hadn't been clear enough in our marketing that it's not a real detective game and you don't need notebooks. I think you don't need to solve ciphers or whatever. I think Tom was watching like a Let's Player who sort of exclusively did detective games, and he had a notebook out, like a camera on his notebook, ready to write down all these clues and stuff. And like, we just felt awful because like he obviously wanted to solve a big mystery, but that's not what the game is. And like, it's fine. Like, it's not like the game needs a big mystery, but we also kind of needed to pay more attention to like why people were upset if they were. We didn't have many people upset, but like we just wanted to make sure that even people that like mystery games or whatever can enjoy it. And part of that was adding the notebook and the sort of that mechanic, because I mean, Frog Detective is about pretending to play a detective game.
Yeah. We have a question here. Does Worm Club have plans to expand into new gameplay styles in the future?
In a sense, I don't know how keen Tom is on this, but I have always my whole life wanted to make a horror game. And I would love to release a horror game after I'm finished with Frog Detective.
Yeah.
Like I would. Oh yeah, it's a bit thematic with my baby earrings and my spooky Halloween jumper. I love horror. I love it so much. It's my favorite thing in the whole world. And I want to make a horror game. I just don't know if I'll be any good at it, so I'm too scared to start.
Um, Excellent. We're kind of reaching towards the end of the session. So I think that might be a good final spooky future facing note to end on. Thanks so much for joining us, Grace. That was excellent.
Yeah, I very much enjoyed it.
I want to remind everyone, sadly, this was the final session of this year's series, but you can find all the episodes, all 8 of them, including this one, recorded and archived on this year ACMI's YouTube channel. Thanks to all of you, all the viewers who tuned in along the way and asked questions, and especially a big, big thanks to the ACMI staff for co-hosting this with us and running the series with us. It's great to finally do this online. We definitely couldn't have done it without ACMI. So yeah, we really enjoyed co-hosting this series. There are a couple of final events that RMIT Games and ACMI wanted to spruik to all of you watching this. And so we'll link these. I believe the ACMI staff is going to link all of these live in the chat. First, there's a public expression of interest for ACMI's 2021 Audience Lab event. So if you might be interested in testing your game publicly next year, could be worth filling out that expression of interest, which I think ACMI is gonna link right now. Then we want to tell you about 2 events happening real soon during Melbourne International Games Week, which is happening in early October. And so as part of International Games Week, Melbourne International Games Week, ACMI is hosting Big Games Night In. It's an online event kicking off Sunday, October 4th, and it's running throughout Games Week. And they'll be showcasing 8 Victorian makers, actually including Grace herself. And so that's a great kind of online event to check out coming up real soon. And then finally, one from us at RMIT Games. We are running our 3rd annual feedback forum on Friday, October 9th, 11 a.m. Melbourne time, again, as part of Melbourne International Games Week and supported by Creative Victoria. So we're hoping that some of you will want to join us for a live stream as a panel of international experts, play a selection of 3 in-progress Australian games, and give constructive feedback to the teams in front of a live audience. I wanted to mention, if you are an Australian developer and you're possibly interested in pitching, we were talking about pitching with Grace, pitching your game in progress to this really cool selection of 3 experts, we are still taking applications until and through tomorrow night. So again, I believe the ACMI staff is going to post those links. And you can find more info at our kind of Twitter feed at RMIT Games. So yeah, those are just the Games Talks 2020 series might be over, but there are many more cool ACMI and RMIT Games kind of events and things coming up. Anyway, thanks again, Grace. That was excellent. And I hope everyone goes and checks out Frog Detective. It's great. Go play it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.